all of you know, as all of you know, Marblehead and its people have just an incredible history and made extraordinary contributions to the founding of our country. You know that. And if you're reading Patrick O'Donnell's new book, Indispensables, the extent of our ancestors and our town's involvement really becomes very clear. And the town's history since the Revolution, I find equally compelling. The issue is there is no one place in town that tells the entire story of Marblehead's history. Existing organizations such as the Historical Commission and the Marblehead Museum and our venues each tell a part of the story, but none of us really been able to tell the entire story of Marblehead's history. So how are we doing this? How do we want to do this? We've decided on the Historical Commission to work toward establishing a permanent museum of Marblehead history that lays out the town's history from its beginning to the present. In order to see what works best in telling this story, we have worked to decided to try to develop concepts and to develop material through three sequential exhibits. And they focus really on the use of maps. And David has brought this to us in a very big way. These maps really inform us as to how Marblehead has changed since the time when this was the Native Americans' land. We are certainly grateful to the Shattuck Fund, the National Grand Bank, as the trustees, who's provided the majority of the funding for all three exhibits in this series. We could not have done this without them. So tonight's talk is going to cover the first of the three exhibits, mapping Marblehead from founding to freedom. That was held during the summer of 2019 in the townhouse. But coming attractions, the Commission's second exhibit, Mapping Marblehead in the 19th Century, which he had originally planned for last year, and for obvious reasons, is now going to be delayed until this year. It will open on July the 10th in the townhouse, and we look forward to seeing you there. So I would really like to thank the Marblehead Museum and Lauren McCormick for hosting tonight's presentation. It's been a huge help in our ability to get our story out. And now Pam Peterson will take it from here.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Lauren, for hosting us. And I'm going to be doing the narrative, but with giving full credit for all the maps that you're going to see to David Crathwell, who really is the map expert. So this exhibit, as Chris mentioned, was funded by the Shattuck Fund as well as the Historical Commission. And it's mapping Marblehead is so rich in history, and it has so much history to tell, 5 centuries of stories. So the maps that we'll be looking at tonight are from the 17th and 18th century, and they set the framework for understanding Marblehead's people, places, and events. So Marblehead in the 1600s. This, as we all know, the land was already occupied when the first settlers came to the New World, and it was the Native American tribes were here. In this region it was the Namkeg, but this is a detail from an early map, a 17th century map, and it shows the Englishmen's images of the Native Americans, and their homes are behind them. And so this is something that we will be keeping in mind. This map that you're going to see, that you're seeing here, was actually shows E stands for encampments. This is here in Marblehead. And there are forts and lookouts and burial sites. And these are places that have been discovered over the years. And this map was compiled by Don Dolliver, who is the town historian. And you can find out more, see this map more extensively on the Commission's website at marbleheadhistory.org. So finding New England, of course, it is, this is one of the earliest maps, and this is the first use of the name New England. John Smith gave the region the name New England, and began mapping it. This is Marblehead in the 1600s, another an early map by William Woods. This is 1634. And this is an interesting map because it refers, in the text, it refers to Marblehead, and mentions that it's such a good place for fishing and a good harbor for boats. And interesting to note on the map, in fact, it's spelled Marble Harbor. And here in the to the left of that is James Sagamore. Now, James Sagamore was the son of Nanapashamet, and the region that he was in charge of was in the Saugus area. In Marblehead, another one of Nanapashamet's sons was Sagamore George, and we'll hear a little bit more about him later. But it's also interesting to know that over here it says Nahumkek, which is early spelling of Namkeg. Okay. So this is another map of New England, and the orientation is sort of odd. So it's actually easier to see it if it's turned sideways, which we'll do. And this is a detail where you see Marblehead. And this is the first map that uses the modern spelling of Marblehead. So Marblehead is here. Boston Harbor is way back here. Some of the proportions are a little off, but but it's, all things considered, is a pretty accurate and interesting map. And maps in general are just fascinating to look at because they really do tell us so many different kinds of things that we need to know about early settlement. So talking about early settlement, we know that Marblehead was settled, was incorporated in 1629 as a part of Salem. And the early settlement was all around Little Harbor. So this is a map of Marblehead as it appeared in 1649, when Marblehead separated from Salem. And as you know, Marblehead was founded by fishermen and Salem was founded by Puritans. So their objectives and their points of view were very, very, very different. And the early colonial courts were filled with people who were brought in because they were Marbleheaders who were not following the rules and the laws of Salem, not attending church on the Sabbath, and being drunk and disorderly and that sort of thing. So I think in 1649, when this separation took place, it was a great relief to everyone. As I say, you can see here that the settlement here is primarily around Little Harbor, and most of Marblehead is all farmland. So and this is the ancient highway that's heading towards Salem. So these are things that inform us about what Marblehead looked like in 1649. And Sidney Purley was a historian and archivist, and he took on this amazing task of compiling these early maps from town deeds and documents. And so we'll see more of his maps as we go along. And so I think I might have, let me just see. Wait a minute. Okay, yeah. So as I say, most of the people who came to Marblehead early were fishermen. This is a reconstructed model of a shallop. They fished in these small boats. They didn't go very far afield early in the 1700s, but they did a lot of fishing. And fishing was the first and the most enduring trade that provided income for the colonies. And of course, some of these early maps, one of the real purpose of them was to advertise the colonies, advertise the New World, and encourage people to come and settle. And of course, fishing was a way that people could support themselves. And so King James actually told everyone, or added his input, which was that Jesus' apostles had been fishermen, and so it was a good and good trade for people to follow. And codfish were indeed the mainstay of New England economy for several hundred years. It's not an accident that on top of the State House in Boston is a golden cod. So this is what, so fishing, catching the fish, and drying the fish, salting it, and then selling it, packing in barrels and selling it both in back to England and to the West Indies were all very much a part of the economy of New England. This is the town deed, which is has actually just returned, I believe, this week to the Selectmen's Room in Abbott Hall. It's dated 1684, and the deed, all the town deeds that exist throughout New England towns are from about this time period, because after King Philip's War, which was the sort of the final stand of the Native Americans against the English settlers, the King of England realized that the English needed some way of documenting and legalizing this land, which of course they actually stole, but they wanted something, some piece of paper to show what they had. So the town deed, which, as I say, is in the Selectmen's Room, is signed by Marblehead Selectmen, the Marblehead Selectmen, and the descendants of Nanapashmet. The painting that's inset here is by J.O.J. Frost, and he's showing this event taking place of the Selectmen and the Native Americans signing the deeds. So Sagamore George was the descendant who would have been the one to sign this, except he had been captured during King Philip's War, enslaved and sent to the West Indies. And they frantically tried to find him, did find him, brought him back, but he died before it was time to sign the deed. So it was his widow whose actual signature is on the deed. So this is a detail from one of the Pearly maps, and you can see this is Marblehead. This is 1700s, so we're just about to move into the 18th century, and you can see Burial Hill. You can see the location of the meeting house. You see Little Harbor and some of the properties that were owned and what the owners' names were. To the left of Burial Hill, you also see Redd's Pond. In this spelling, it's R-E-D. It's not normally spelled as R-E-D-D. But that leads us to the next, the end of the 1600s and the Salem witch trials in 1692. In 1692, a group of young girls in Salem began accusing women of being witches, that the witches were being instructed by the devil. People, of course, really truly believed in the devil at that time, and there was a mass hysteria that went on. And one of the people who was accused was Wilmot Redd, known as Mammy Redd, from Marblehead. She was the wife of a poor fisherman. And why they even knew about her or picked on her is really, it's not clear how they came to have her name. But she was arrested and put on trial and convicted of being a witch. And she was one of 19 people that were killed during the Salem witch trials. So that sort of is the not exactly a claim to fame, but it is something, a part of Marblehead's history, for sure. So now we move into Marblehead in the 1700s. And this is a collection of maps by Sidney Pearly of Marblehead in 1700. They're of a wide variety of different scales. So they've been put together like this so that you can sort of see what the whole whole area would have looked like. But you can also, these are also on the Marblehead Museum website if you want to look at them individually. And of course, all of these maps are also on the Commission's website at marbleheadhistory.org. And you can notice, for example, that the neck is empty except for one small farm. Still, most of the concentration of settlement it's moved from not beyond Little Harbor into the Great Harbor, but still, by and large, and it is also extended to Peaches Point to some extent. But other than that, most of the rest of the land is virtually uninhabited and being used for farmland. So this is the home of Parson Barnard, and he was a young man, a graduate of Harvard College, who was a minister and came to Marblehead. And he was actually quite a smart young man, and he sort of observed the fishing trade and made the suggestion that the fishermen should sell their fish on their own and not use a middleman. And so people started doing that. Joseph Swett, who was actually the father of Martha Swett Lee, was one of the first people to do it. And they sold the fish directly, and they began to make a lot more money. And of course, by the 1700s, the fishing schooners were going to the Grand Banks. This is a map that shows you. So Marblehead is here's Marblehead, and they went all the way to, and this sort of a shaded area is the Grand Bank. So past Nova Scotia, off Newfoundland. So huge long distance to go to, but they caught these enormous fish and brought them back and salted them and dried them. And so this was, of course, it became an increasingly lucrative business. There were many dangers for the fishermen. There were rough seas and bad storms and pirates. And there is an amazing story, true story of Marblehead, of this young man named Philip Ashton, who was on a fishing schooner, and the vessel was attacked by Ned Lowe, who was a notorious pirate, and Philip Ashton was seized to become a pirate crewman. And so he was taken, and this is the route of the voyage. So they were captured off Newfoundland up here, and he was working as a pirate all the way down the East Coast, and they finally got down into the Caribbean. And the Pirates of the Caribbean at Disney World is not just pretend. There really were pirates in the Caribbean, and they really were. It's where they went to rest and recover and count their gold and all of the sorts of things like that. So when the pirate ship stopped at a deserted island to get water, Philip Ashton was able to escape. He escaped from the pirates, and they couldn't find him in the jungle where of the island where he had escaped, and so he was left there. He was marooned, and he made his way to the island of Roatan, and from there he saw some English ships and made contact with them, and they brought him back to Salem, and he made his way back to Marblehead. And I'm just going to go back to show you. This is his house, which is still standing on Elm Street. And almost 2 years after he had been captured, he walked through the door of his parents' house and said, "I'm back." So as I said, the fishing was becoming more and more successful, and in Marblehead, and of course throughout New England, there was the codfish aristocracy, and two of the homes that were built as a result of all this money made from fishing were the King Hooper Mansion, which is this house, and the Jeremiah Lee Mansion. This is a map of existing Marblehead buildings that were built between 1660 1763 and 1799. You can see the red ones are the 17th century buildings and the black ones are the 18th century buildings. You can see what an enormous growth in less than 100 years was taking place. And it was, of course, the arrows are indicating where the Hooper Mansion and the Lee Mansion were. But this Marblehead was becoming very, very prosperous town. This is a graph that shows that prosperity. So these are the largest cities in the American colonies in 1760. And you can see that Marblehead was the 6th largest town or city in the American colonies. So this is pretty amazing for what we still sort of think of as a small town. I think that one of the things that this prosperity brought to all of the American colonies, because while Marblehead was very successful, the colonies in general were doing fairly well, was that they were successful. The king was taxing them frequently because he needed money, and the colony, and he was able to get it from the colonies. But of course, this created resentment, and they sort of tug between more independence. But I think that because the colonies were so successful, that it gave them the confidence to sort of fight back and push back against England. So this is a Marblehead man, Dr. Elijah Story. He was a member of the Sons of Liberty and one of the attackers who they went on board an English vessel and threw the tea, the cargo of tea overboard. They dressed as American Indians, and that's sort of many of these stories are a whole other story that could be discussed. But that, and Elijah Story also fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he treated some wounded people there as well. He also just is the father of Joseph Story, who was the youngest Supreme Court justice. And so Joseph Story is kind of claimed by Marblehead and Salem because he lived more of his life in Salem. Another Marbleheader who was significant in the big run up to the American Revolution was Major Pedrick. This is a painting at the Marblehead Museum by J.O.J. Frost, but it illustrates the story pretty well. Colonel Leslie was coming with his troops of redcoats, and they were heading to Salem because there were reports that there were weapons and gunpowder being held there. So you can see that they've come into Marblehead Harbor, and they rowed across to the shore, and then they're marching. And they marched from Marblehead to Salem. The man on the white horse is Major Pedrick, who saw this happening, and he rode to Salem to give the alarm, to give the warning. When Leslie's troops arrived at the North River, they were met by the Salem regiment's militia, and Leslie made the decision not to fight, but to retreat. So that's, of course, why it's called Leslie's Retreat. And he turned around and they marched back to Marblehead Harbor and went home again. So this was almost the first battle of the American Revolution, but not quite. The first battle was, and as we all know, was at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. And this is an illustration and also sort of a map showing the advance of the redcoats. And again, they were doing the same thing. They were coming to seize gunpowder and weapons that were being stored at Lexington. One of Marblehead's most famous sons is Elbridge Gerry, and he was very active both before, during, and after the American Revolution. He was worked with Jeremiah Lee, and before the American Revolution, he was with Lee at Lexington. the night that before of the battle. And it was at that time that Jeremiah Lee had to hide out in the cornfield and caught his death of cold. Gary was always very, very sad. He was very close to Lee, and he was very sad that this happened. Gary then was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and this, as you can see, his signature here. He went on to become the governor of Massachusetts, during which time he signed the redistricting bill, which is known as gerrymandering, and because it's named after him, and the fact that the redistricting map looked a lot like a salamander, so that's why it was called that. But Gary was certainly an important figure in the American Revolution, and certainly in Marblehead's history. And of course, we all know the importance of Glover's regiment. And here's George Washington crossing the Delaware. The men rowing the boat are members of Glover's regiment, who, because they were all fishermen, knew how to handle these boats. And this was an amazing moment in the American Revolution. There had been no Washington's army, the Continental Army, had no victories at all, and they made the sneak attack on Trenton, on the Hessians at Trenton on Christmas night in 1776, and they they were successful. It was the first victory of the American Revolution, and therefore very important for morale as well as just keeping everything going. And this is the current Glover's regiment. So these are the reenactors, and this was the photo op that was in the first exhibit. And so the Glover's regiment came and posed in this picture, and all the visitors to the exhibit could also pose in the exhibit. And for the new exhibit that will open in July, there's also a photo opportunity, and it's a secret. We won't tell you what it is, so you have to come and see. But it's also a great chance to have your picture taken in a historical setting. So Marblehead had many visitors important visitors that came to the town, and one was the Marquis de Lafayette. He came twice. He came right after the American Revolution to meet his friend General John Glover, and then he came in 1824. Glover had died, but he still had a great fondness for Marblehead and came. And this is when his boat came into Marblehead Harbor, and a carriage brought him up the steep hill, and this is where the Marblehead myth was born, that Lafayette's carriage couldn't get around the corner, so they had to chop the corner off of this house so that he could get by. Of course, that's not true, but it's one of those stories that will never die, and everybody loves it. So it just will continue. And the house, of course, is still there with the corner missing. And the theory is that it was actually a shop, and then it was intentionally built like that. So. And of course, General George Washington also came to Marblehead, and he came in 1789 when he became president. He visited all the 13 colonies, and he was very he wanted to come. He made a special trip, made a special request to come to Marblehead. It was out of the way, and they had to sort of work it into his schedule. But when he came to Marblehead, he was very saddened by the appearance of the town. What had once been such a prosperous small city town had lost men, it had lost vessels, and it had lost income. So the town looked very shabby and poor. So Washington wished everyone good fortune. He hoped for better times ahead, and he said in this letter, which is in the Selectmen's Room at Abbott Hall, he talks about, he says to the citizens, your attachment to the contribution of to the creation of the United States is worthy of men who fought and bled for freedom and who know its value. So he really very much admired Marbleheaders, and of course they admired him in return. And so, as I say, he was a very important visitor to the town. And this is the final map. This is the first map that was drawn of the town of Marblehead, and it's 1795, and it shows many of the locations that are still here. This again you can see in greater detail on the website, but you can see that the old townhouse is mentioned here, Fort Sewell, and Burial Hill, but one thing that isn't here anymore, number 12, is the stump of an ancient apple tree, and for whatever reason that was considered something important to note on the map, but it isn't there anymore. It's right at although it's right at the Salem Marblehead town borders. So this gives you an overview, a short run through of what went on in the first 2 centuries of Marblehead's history. And on July 10th, the Mapping Marblehead, the 19th century, will open at the old townhouse. Again, you can find more information about the exhibit and about this exhibit and the future exhibits and about the Historical Commission at marbleheadhistory.org. One thing I just want to point out is that you notice how many of these maps, documents, and all of this information, we only know this because it's been saved. And so having a good archival storage and a way of protecting all of these things is essential to our history, our past history, our current history, and it's something that we really need to be aware of. We have booklets that explain all this in greater detail, and they're available free at the Marblehead Museum and at the Abbott Hall gift shop. So we hope that you'll come in and pick up one of those, and you'll have it to take home and study at your leisure. So thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Pam. That was a great overview, and we're excited to see the new exhibit coming up soon. So we'll take questions now. So if you have questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat. Kira asks, what do we know about the Native American burial sites? Are they marked in any way?
I don't believe so. Some of the areas of that are the forts, you can sort of see some remnants of those, but that's a good question, and it would certainly be something to be considered as a possibility. There were some early signs about Indian Village. I believe there was still one down by Devereaux Beach, but this is something that we're all beginning to learn more about Indigenous people, and as well as people of color, and so all of these aspects are something that is something that we want to be thinking about as we're going forward, and that we're, as I say, starting to learn more about.
Just to add that, Pam, that it's the case that we really don't want people to know where the burial sites are, if in fact we do know. The idea being that these are very important to the Native Americans. We don't want them disturbed. As far as the villages go, there is in fact a sign, as you said, it's on Ocean Avenue. It's moved just a little bit from where it was originally placed. It's a tercentenary sign. It was put up in 30 something or other.
The 30s, I think, the 1930s.
The 30s, yeah, by the WPA. And I just wanted to mention that unfortunately it does misidentify the name of the community that lived here. So it's the nom keg, not the, I believe it says Nipmuc, if I remember correctly. So hopefully
Oh,
we
right, right.
can add some context to that sign, which in and of itself is a historical piece since it's
Right.
almost 100 years old.
Right.
Great. So a couple other questions have come up. Gary asks, what is the oldest house in Marblehead? I assume that still exists. I assume.
I believe it's considered to be the Ambrose Gale House on Franklin Street. There there are quite a fair number of early houses, but of course many of them, that they've been altered quite a bit. But the Ambrose Gale, you really can see that it's a first period style house. And so it's certainly a good example.
Absolutely. That's on Franklin Street for those who might want to check it out. Right on Franklin Street there. There's also 46 Lee Street, which is probably about 1660, the original part. Let's see.
That's the Fisherman's House, the little Fisherman's House.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a great example because, you have the Ambrose Gale House is a much grander house. But the one on Lee Street that Lauren just mentioned, it was a fisherman's house. And that would be much more typical of the early houses because it's kind of a big one-room thing with a large hearth and the fireplace in the center to keep everybody warm. And then kind of almost like a sleeping loft upstairs. I mean, there is a second floor, but it's eaved, but it would have been very warm up there because people sort of slept around the chimney.
Okay, let's see. Will there be another Zoom regarding the upcoming exhibit?
I think so. It's maybe later on. I think you can go and one of the reasons we decided to do this was because it was such a long time since the first exhibit, and it's sort of to get people interested in this upcoming exhibit, and kind of quickly summarize what was in the first exhibit. And as I say, that the brochure, the booklet that is available, does that very well, so that you can really see all of the points that are mentioned. And of course, for any of these time periods to go through this amount of time and this amount of material in a short period of time or in an exhibit means that not everything gets included, but this is sort of an overview of more or less what was happening in those centuries.
Thomas asks if there were colonial houses in Clifton.
I believe there were some farmhouses. I don't know how early they were, but I would say probably only a few, and I don't know that any of them remain. I don't believe that they do. I believe there's an 18th century house, one or two 18th century houses, but I don't think, I'm sure there's no 17th century houses in Clifton.
Let's see. Lou says, I learned a lot about how fish were salted from reading Molly Waldo. It's interesting how extensive the fish flakes appear to have been. Might the maps or your talks give more details on fish flakes and the salting process?
I don't think that we don't really have any maps that show. Actually, the frost paintings are some of the best indications of the extensive fish flakes all over the town. The bird's eye view of Marblehead shows the fish flakes. They were out on at Fort Sewell. They were on Skinner's Head, which is where Glover's Landing is now. They were on any open places, but generally around the town, because they weren't put out in the fields because they had to be somewhat protected. If they were, unprotected, birds and animals could come and steal the salted fish. But the fish flakes, as you probably know, were sort of low, almost like picnic tables, slatted tables, and the fish were, the raw fish was salted and laid out in the sun to dry. And you can actually still see some of that process in Newfoundland. They still dry some fish up there. There's also accounts of early accounts from letters and diaries of how bad Marblehead smelled in spring and fall, because that was the main fishing voyages were in spring and fall, and people and when they came back, the vessels came into the fishing schooners came into the harbor. They rinsed the fish in the salt water and then salted it and laid it out in any place that they could find to dry. And I think Marbleheaders were used to the smell, but visitors were not. Didn't really noticed it when they came to town.
Yeah, if I can just add, the Pearly map of 1700 actually shows on what's today Waldron Street. It's labeled highway leading to the fish fences, and you can see that that's one mention of it. There are a couple of them on the maps, but they really are more well documented on the later maps in the next century.
Yeah, I think
Sorry.
that's some of the 19th century, because of course 18th century fishing was certainly active and very prosperous, but the trade in the 19th century really was even more so, certainly for the first part of the 19th century.
Great. Okay, so just to respond to one thing, the Native American sign we're referring to near Devereaux, yes, it was replaced in 2012, but it is an exact copy of the original tercentenary WPA project from the 1930s sign that existed, just to answer that question. No, I asked that one, sorry. Are there enough maps to track the building of all the buildings in town as they were erected across the years?
David, you can answer that.
Yeah, just unmuting myself here. There really aren't. The map that you'll see on the interactive maps is a modern day map that I created from Mass Historical Commission data, which uses dates that are on houses that currently exist. So anything that was built early on and torn down and then something else was built on top of it, it would not be recorded on that map. So what you see in that map, and I've done an animation that shows you the buildup of the town of Marblehead over all of the centuries. And one of the things you'll see there is all of the houses that come into existence, but they're only the ones that still exist. They're not the ones that were torn down and rebuilt.
Did a lot of historic houses get destroyed with the fires in the 19th century?
Actually, no. Marblehead was quite fortunate that it really never had so there were fires in the 19th century, and that at the end of the 19th century that destroyed the shoe factories, and so in 1877 and 1888. But generally speaking, the historic district, one of the reasons that we're so fortunate to have all of these houses is because it hasn't been they haven't been destroyed by fire. And it is kind of unusual, and it's a very special thing that hasn't happened. So you can see like the shoe factory fires, which started on Pleasant Street and worked their way down towards the Warwick Theater and that area. That's all of those buildings are later, because that was a lot of that was burnt out. But in the historic district, really not. There were a few individual house fires, but not very many.
So why would you say, why were so many houses preserved in Marblehead, historic houses?
Well, actually, Marblehead, it was, I guess, the irony of Marblehead is that as I mentioned, it was devastated after the American Revolution, and then the early 19th century, there were embargoes, and then there was a War of 1812, and so the fishing fleet took a while to really get started again, and was reasonably successful in the first part of the 19th century, but then the Great Gale of 1846 kind of wiped out fishing, and shoemaking came in. But Marblehead struggled through the 19th century to find a sort of a lasting way for people to make a living. And so, because while some individuals had success, overall it was still quite a poor town. So because it was poor, people didn't have the money to tear down their houses or remodel their houses, or even upgrade them. And so by the end of the 19th century, when Marblehead began to be discovered by artists and tourists, and it looked very quaint and ancient and charming. And so and then people began to realize that wasn't necessarily a negative, that it was a positive. And so the interest in keeping the old houses sort of began because they were still there, but they were still there because nobody was able to afford to get rid of them.
Question actually about the slide that we have up right now. The picture, let's see, third down on the right, Day asks if that is the Harris Shoe Factory.
Yes, it is.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Lou asks about the early period of the various neighborhoods, including Clifton. There's the extensive historical commission project of Marblehead Survey Master Plan on marbleheadhistory.org. That's a great resource, he says. So not a question, a comment for those people who might want to look more into that. Thomas asks, what was the last vestige of American Indians in Marblehead?
Well, I think even quite early on, by the time the English settlers came to Marblehead, we know Nana Pashment was the sachem, the chief of the tribe here in the Marblehead region. They were nomadic. So they came to Marblehead in the summer the same way that people come now. They came to fish and to enjoy the breezes and be beside the ocean. They collected salt and things like that. But as I say, by the time the early settlers came, they basically were only marginally here. They had been wiped out by smallpox epidemics and by intertribal warfare with other tribes. So there really wasn't much of a presence when the English settlers came here. So I don't think that there was much interaction. But that's again something that would be interesting to do more research, because I think that there is more information to be found, and just hasn't been really uncovered yet.
Great. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you, Pam. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris, so much for a great presentation. And we've gotten a couple questions, so I will answer this. Yes, it is being recorded. What I'll do is anybody who's registered will get a Zoom link tomorrow, and then it will also go up on our YouTube page, the museum's YouTube page tomorrow. And then MHTV will have it as well. I'm not sure what their schedule will be, but they'll announce it when they can broadcast it. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And don't forget to go visit the new exhibit starting in July. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.